Thank you once again for this absolutely brilliant session. Moving on immediately to our next session. And may I ask you, how seriously have you taken mythology as literature? Because we are going to dedicate one entire session to mythology and, of course, to the greatest epic ever, the Mahabharata. We have with us Mr. Bibek Debroy, economist, member of Niti Aayog, and the author responsible for the unabridged translation of the Mahabharata in 10 volumes. I now invite Mr. Debroy to please join us on stage. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Mr. Bibek Debroy. And I'll request him to speak on.
Thank you and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a pleasure to be here at the invitation of the New Indian Express and Mr. Chawla in particular at the Odisha Litfest. The topic that's been given to me is the question of whether the Mahabharata is still relevant today. The last time I was invited here and got an opportunity to speak here on the Mahabharata, I got 10 minutes. This time I've got, half an hour to speak and 15 minutes of Q&A. I can see that Prabhu Chawla and New Indian Express is listening, so I hope that the next time I'm invited, I get 2 hours to speak on the Mahabharata. I would like to publicly acknowledge the presence of Kartika, who then used to be with Penguin, who in a sense started this journey of mine with the Mahabharata. Having done that, I'm going to speak for about half an hour, and then we'll have enough time for an interactive session. In an attempt to answer the question of why the Mahabharata is still relevant, I will focus on 4 different kinds of arguments. The first 3 arguments I will only briefly elucidate and spend much more of time on the 4th one. So what is the first one? The first one I want to mention is that the Mahabharata, and by the way, when I say the Mahabharata, everything that I am going to say is on the basis of the critical edition of the Mahabharata, which was collated and brought out by the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute between the years 1916 and 1966. So the first question, why is the Mahabharata still relevant? It's poetry. In some parts, it is beautiful poetry. I'm not going to get into the question, the debated issue which can never be resolved about whether a single person composed the Mahabharata. That's not a question that can ever be satisfactorily resolved. Nonetheless, let's assume for the moment that it was Krishna the Vaipayan Vedavyas who composed the Mahabharata. As a poet, Vedavyas was quite different from the kind of poet that Valmiki was. And there's a very, very useful contrast between the poetry of the Valmiki Ramayana and that of Vedavyasa's Mahabharata. Vedavyas is much more matter of fact. He describes incidents, he describes characters, he does not waste his time describing the beauty of nature, which is Valmiki's forte. Sanskrit poetry, you must understand, was slightly different in structure from the way we understand poetry today. Poetry today is invariably interpreted as rhyming. In the sense of rhyming, Sanskrit poetry never had rhyming until the advent of someone who's important in a place like this, namely Jayadeva. Take, for example, the following. And I'm not going to translate this, not in this state. Pralaya payodhi jale dhrita vanasi vedang vihitava hitram charitram akhedam keshava dhrita meena sharira jaya jagadisha hare. Vadasi yadi kinchidapi dantaruchi kaumudi harati darati meramati ghoram Sfurata dharasi dhabe tava vadana chandrama rochetu lochana chakoram. This kind of poetry is very uncharacteristic of classical Sanskrit poetry. Classical Sanskrit poetry was bound by chanda and meter. And certainly so far as the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and the Puranas are concerned, the most popular chanda was something called Anushtup. I will now recite a very familiar shloka and hesitate before answering my question. Yada yada hi dharmasya glanirvavati parantapa abhuthanang adharmasya tadatmanang srijamaham. Where is this from? If you said the Bhagavad Gita, you are wrong. The relevant shloka from the Bhagavad Gita is Yada yada hi dharmasya glanirvavati bharata abhuthanang adharmasya tadatmanang srijamaham. I did not quote that. What I quoted is Yada yada hi dharmasya glanirvavati parantapa abhuthanang adharmasya tadatmanang srijamaham. In the first case, when it is parantapa, the chanda breaks down. When it is Bharata, the chanda is maintained. And that shloka with Parantapa is also from the Mahabharata, except that it is not from the Bhagavad Gita section. Let me cite another shloka right towards the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita. This is the second shloka in the Bhagavad Gita. After Dhritarashtra has asked the question to Sanjaya about what happened after the two armies had come together to clash on the fields of Dharmashetra, Kurukshetra. This is the first shloka that Sanjaya utters. Drishtva tu buran pandavanikang durja dhanastada Acharyam upasangyamya raja vachanam avravit. King Duryodhan, on seeing the assembled armies, goes to the Acharya, Dronacharya, and speaks to him. Many people have written learned articles asking the following question. Why did he go to Dronacharya? Dronacharya was not the commander-in-chief, not at that point in time. The commander-in-chief at that point in time was Bhishma. So why did he go to Drona? Some people said, well, because Drona was a Brahmana, there was no guarantee that Drona would actually fight. Some people have said that Drona was a salaried employee. Again, there was no particular guarantee that he would fight. Some other people have written saying that Drona was very fond of Arjuna, so maybe he would not fight seriously against Drona. Perhaps they are right. But perhaps it's also possible that Vedavyasa thought of nothing of these, none of these. If you think of any of the words that might be used for Bhishma, Devavrata, Gangya, the chanda would have broken down. And probably Vedavyas had nothing more important in mind except the fact that had he used some other name, the Chanda would have broken down. So that's reason number one, poetry. And no matter of translation can capture the beauty of that poetry. Reason number two is geography. There is a wealth of geographical material in the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata is not only about a fight between the Kurus and the Pandavas. There is much, much more in the Mahabharata. There's a wealth of geographical material. There is a wealth of material on what can broadly be called dharma, particularly Vedanta, Sankhya, and Yoga. There is a wealth of material on geography, a wealth of material that has still not been adequately researched and collated because of the belief, the unwarranted belief that all of this, whether it is the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the Puranas, they represent myths. Don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting for a minute that everything occurred exactly as it was described, but there was a core element of truth. And hence, this wealth of geographical material. For example, I'm not very sure how many of you present here know why Baramulla is known as Baramulla. Baramulla is known as Baramulla because it was known as Varahamula. It was the place where Vishnu, in his Varaha incarnation, used his tusks to raise the earth from the water into which the earth had sunk because of the act of a demon. So Baramulla is actually Varahamula. Particularly in a state like this, you ought to be aware that Chitrangada, according to the Mahabharata, is not necessarily from Manipur. There is a reference to Manipur, but the Mahabharata also describes the place as Manalura. And whether it is Manalura or whether it is Manipura, the description, particularly of proximity to the ocean, is such that it is almost certain that that particular Manalura or Manipura was not where Manipur is today, but actually happens to be in Orissa. So the second reason is the wealth of geographical material. The third part that I'd like to flag pertains to Raja Dharma. Most of you present here, all of you present here know that while Bhishma was lying down on his bed of arrows, he instructed Yudhishthira on royal craft, on Raja Dharma, in Shanti Parva, in Anushasana Parva. Let me give you an example. If it is a rich person, you should not imprison that rich person because of a crime he or she has committed. If it is a rich person, the rich person should not be imprisoned because of a crime he or she has committed, because imprisoning a rich person is at the expense of the public exchequer. Society as a whole pays. Instead, a monetary penalty should be imposed on a rich person, and only the relatively poor who are unable to pay should be imprisoned. If I state this to you, you will say, aha, these are the guys who do research on law and economics at the University of Chicago who have thought of this wonderful proposition. It is actually something that Bhishma tells Dhritarashtra lying down on the bed of arrows. Lying down on that bed of arrows, Dhritarashtra lists out for Yudhishthira the 17 most important kind of civil cases that the king must address in order of priority. And guess what was number one in that day and age? Number one in that day and age, number one in that list of 17 was breach of contract. Today, all of us as citizens expect all kinds of things that the government should do for us. The government should do this. The government should do that. In that day and age, the role for the government interpreted as the king was extremely narrow. The role of the king was only to ensure external security, internal security, defense, law and order, rule of law. Everything else was done by citizens. Everything else was done by communities. This is not just in the Mahabharata, but also in Kautilya's Arthashastra. So there is a rich body of material on royal conduct and royal craft. Now let me turn to the fourth reason, the reason that all of us immediately identify with, and that is the notion of dharma. Dharma is a word that I personally think should never be translated into English. Because dharma is not religion. Dharma can only be imperfectly translated as religion. Dharma means all kinds of different things depending on the context. At one level, it is sadachara, good behavior. At one level, it is the kind of Raja Dharma that I mentioned. At one level, it is Varnashrama Dharma. But the moral of the Mahabharata story is, transcending all of this, Dharma is what is individual to you. Dharma is what you decide Dharma to be. And the moral of the Mahabharata stories is, different people in the same situation may face different courses of action. And given the same situation, similar individuals may choose different kinds of action leading to different consequences. And there is always a conflict of dharma. It is never the case that you clearly know what is right and what is wrong. Depending on what you choose, you have to suffer consequences. The reason why all of us continue to identify with the Mahabharata even today is that the context may be different. The socio-economic milieu may be different, but the conflict of dharma, the dilemma, the personal choices, the personal conflicts are conflicts that each one of us faces every day, day in and day out. And that is the reason why we continue to identify with the Mahabharata and will continue to identify with the Mahabharata for years and years and decades and decades. Let me give you an example to illustrate what I meant by similar individuals adopting two different courses of action. All of us knew about Bhishma Deva Vrata, who had adopted a vow of brahmacharya. When he adopted the vow of brahmacharya, I'm not going to get into the details, but when he adopted that vow of brahmacharya, he was confronted with a situation where he needed to marry the princess of Kashi, Amba. And Amba said, if you do not marry me, I will immolate myself in the fire. Bhishma said, I have a vow of brahmacharya, so Amba, I cannot marry you, I have to protect my vow. Consequently, Amba immolated herself, was reborn as Shikandi, and eventually led to Bhishma's destruction. So this is the choice that Bhishma made. Unlike Bhishma, probably it is not that well known that Arjuna also adopted a vow of brahmacharya for a limited period of 1 year. For a limited period of 1 year, Arjuna also had this vow of brahmacharya. While he was observing this limited vow of brahmacharya for 1 year, he was approached by a princess of the Nagas named Ulupi. And Ulupi fell in love with Arjuna and said that if you do not marry me, I will kill myself. You now have to make a choice about which dharma is more important to you, the dharma of observing the vow of brahmacharya or the dharma of protecting the life of a woman. Very similar situation. Given that very similar situation, unlike Bhishma, Arjuna decided to marry Ulupi. Just to illustrate that different people given very similar situations may adopt different courses of action. The Mahabharata, or at least the unabridged Mahabharata, is extremely nuanced in terms of these conflicts of dharma. It is not in terms of black and white that the Kauravas are bad and the Pandavas are good. It is always gradations of grey. And if we distill it to clear black and white, we do a grave injustice to the Mahabharata. Everyone knows about Ekalavya. Ekalavya has become a symbol for oppression of scheduled tribes in India. Consider the Ekalavya incident as it is described in the Mahabharata. Ekalavya comes to Dronacharya and says, please accept me as your student. And Dronacharya says, I only teach the sons of kings. I only teach princes. Dronacharya does not say, I do not teach nishadas, which is what you would have expected had it been discrimination against nishadas. Instead, Dronacharya says, I only teach princes. Taken at face value, this would suggest that if it was an ordinary Kshatriya, Dronacharya would not have taught that ordinary Kshatriya either. He will promptly mention the instance of subsequently Dronacharya asking for Ekalavya's thumb. What precisely happened then? Much before this, Dronacharya had gone to have a bath with his disciples and his thigh was grasped by a crocodile. When his thigh was grasped by a crocodile, Arjuna saved Dronacharya, and Dronacharya gave Arjuna the boon that he would ensure that Arjuna would become the best archer in the world. When the 5 Pandava princes and Dronacharya encounter Ekalavya and discover that he was a great archer, Arjuna reminds Dronacharya of this vow and says, please stick to your promise. Dronacharya is thus faced with this conflict of dharma that I have mentioned. Does he do something unfair and ask for Ekalavya's thumb, or does he stick to his vow of ensuring that Arjuna would be the greatest archer? It so happened that Dronacharya asked for Ekalavya's thumb. Before you jump to any more conclusions, let me also quickly ask you actually, who do you think killed Ekalavya? And I am prepared to take a bet that very few people here will know that Ekalavya was actually killed by Krishna. Why was Ekalavya killed by Krishna? Because Ekalavya and Ekalavya's father, they were on Jarasandha's side. And you may be aware that Jarasandha had invaded Mathura 18 times and fought against the Yadavas. Given the fact that Ekalavya's father and Ekalavya were on Jarasandha's side, you form a slightly different perspective as to why Dronacharya might have refused Ekalavya. Let me also quickly flag the famous incident that has become a symbol of oppression of women, namely Draupadi being disrobed. And when you see depictions of Draupadi being disrobed, what is Draupadi clad in? Draupadi is clad in a sari. We must be very careful of not appropriating today's norms and applying them to things that happened thousands of years ago. The norms then were vastly different. And certainly, women never wore saris. Men and women invariably wore two garments, a lower garment and an upper garment. Except that if you are enslaved in the Indian sense, not in the Western sense of a slave, you no longer possess the right to wear an upper garment. Before the Draupadi incident happens, the Pandavas, having lost their independence, having lost in the game with the dice, having become enslaved, had already surrendered their upper garment. If you are given that information, you will form a slightly different impression of why Draupadi was divested of her upper garment. Let me now move on and give you one last instance of conflict of dharma, one that is almost adhyatmic in nature, and then I will stop. This pertains to food habits. Food habits technically have nothing to do with dharma interpreted in the sense of adhyatma. Food habits are functions of socio-economic contexts. In this particular instance, there was a famous sage named Vishwamitra. Vishwamitra was rather an angry sage, an intolerant sage who would impose curses at the drop of a hat. For some reason, Indra was very angry, and it did not rain down for 12 years. For 12 years it did not rain down on earth. There was drought, there was famine, there was no food to be had. Vishwamitra wandered around searching for food. He wandered around searching for food so that he could himself survive, so that he could feed his wife and children. While Vishwamitra was wandering around, he stumbled upon a village of Chandalas. Chandalas are not quite the same thing as Shudras, but let me ignore that. He stumbled upon a village of Chandalas. Chandalas are described as people who possessed dogs and also ate dog flesh. They were swapaka. In this village of Chandalas, Vishwamitra came upon the household of one particular Chandala. In the courtyard of this Chandala's house, a rope was slung across the courtyard, and from that piece of rope, there was the carcass of a dog. A carcass of a dog hung from this rope on the Chandala's courtyard. And half of that had been eaten by the Chandala. The upper quarters of that carcass had been eaten by the Chandala, and only the lower quarters were left. Vishwamitra waited. He waited for the Chandala to fall asleep, because once the Chandala had fallen asleep, he would steal the carcass, take it away, and feed himself and his wife and children. He started to steal it, but there were other dogs that were alive, that were around. They woke up and began to bark and yap. The Chandala also woke up and asked Vishwamitra, "Who are you?" Vishwamitra said, "I am the sage Vishwamitra." Whereupon the Chandala said, "I bow down before you. What can I do for you?" Vishwamitra said, "I want to take away this carcass of the dog so that I can feed myself and my family." For about 10 chapters after that, a conversation ensues between Vishwamitra and the Chandala, with the Chandala trying to restrain Vishwamitra. The Chandala says, "You are a Brahmana. You should not eat flesh. If you eat flesh, you should not eat the flesh of a dog, which is a tainted creature. If you eat the flesh of a tainted creature, you should certainly not eat the hindquarters, which are the most polluted of all." And Vishwamitra keeps saying, "Dharma comes eventually. First let me be alive. If I am not alive, how can I possibly accomplish dharma?" At the end of this conversation, Vishwamitra tells the Chandala, "Who am I? Am I this physical body, or am I the Atman? And who is eating this flesh? If it is the physical body which is eating this flesh, then how is the Atman tainted?" To this kind of question, the Chandala naturally has no answer and says, "Please take this away." So Vishwamitra takes this away. It is a different matter that Indra takes pity and decides to shower down so that Vishwamitra did not actually have to eat the flesh of the dog. All said and done, the Mahabharata is a treatise on dharma. As I said, there is a lot of spirituality and metaphysics in it. Some of you may know that the Bhagavad Gita is only one possible Gita. It may have been the first, but it is only one. There are many other Gitas, and depending on how you count, there are at least 11 other Gitas in the Mahabharata. Last sentence, is the Mahabharata relevant? Of course it is relevant. And I hope I've been able to give you a flavor of why it is relevant. Once you realize it is relevant, then eventually you should end up reading the unabridged Mahabharata, not even in English translation, but in the Sanskrit. Thank you very much. Okay, it's open now for comments.
Am I audible?
Yes,
Okay.
now you are.
Sir, this is regarding dharma and adharma in Mahabharata war. What we were taught when we were children that Arjuna did adharma by getting women in front of him, in front of Bhishma and killing him. But do you think what Bhishma did was dharma? Because he had Ichha Mrityu, still he landed up in a war. Was it dharma? So why Arjuna is depicted in that way, that he did adharma by getting women in front of Bhishma, in front of whom Bhishma will never raise a weapon?
You have misunderstood the broad thrust of what I have said. Do not look at dharma in the sense that you are asking the question in black and white. There are cogent reasons for every protagonist in the Mahabharata to do what he or she did. And the moment you reduce it to simple retellings in black and white, that is suppressed. There were extremely cogent reasons why Bhishma did what he did. There were extremely cogent reasons why Arjuna did what he did. There were extremely cogent reasons why everyone in the Mahabharata did what he or she did.
I agree, sir. But in Indian context, when we were taught all these things at a very young age, that gets imprinted in our mind that Arjuna perhaps did adharma for once, if not.
So you
more.
are not at your young age now. So therefore, read the unabridged Mahabharata, and when you pass it on to the next generation, please tell them that that is not what the Mahabharata is about.
So how to explain this to a 5-year-old kid?
How to explain what?
Mahabharata, that what Bhishma did was also right from certain context. What Arjuna did was also right from certain context. How to explain this to a small kid? When, I mean, at what age we were made to hear all these stories? Perhaps when we were 5 and 6.
Well, that is a choice you will have to make about how you impart that to your children. But I think children do understand that the world is not one where everything is in black and white. I think children understand that. It is only adults who unnecessarily try to simplify matters.
Sir, I have a point. As I understand Mahabharata, it is basically a fight between two sub-clans over the possession of land and women at the dawn of civilization, when human being just has learned to settle down and cultivation, etc. That is how we see Pandavas and Kauravas, they are part of the sub-clans. So it is a fight between over land and possession of women. How, in that broader perspective, when you see the evolution of a civilization, in that context we are perceiving this, and in this transition from being a savage human being to a civilized human being, this is a passage or a transition. This is how we are seeing this. Will you kindly throw a little more light?
I will not throw any light, because the beauty of the Mahabharata is everyone can find whatever he or she wants in the Mahabharata. You have portrayed this as a conflict over land. But remember what I told you, the Mahabharata is not only about a fight between the Kurus and the Pandavas. The moment you look at that Mahabharata broadly, it ceases to be just a conflict over one particular plot of land. I can give you very plausible arguments that the conflict between the Kurus and the Pandavas were not even over a plot of land, but were about cattle. I am referring to the incident that predates chronologically the Kurukshetra battle. So far as the Mahabharata is concerned, let me again reiterate that because there are these conflicts over dharma, because we identify, we will find our own interpretations. And there is nothing which says that your interpretation is superior to mine. There is absolutely nothing wrong with people writing books from Draupadi's perspective. There is absolutely nothing wrong with people writing books from Karna's perspective. But there is also a perspective that is Duryodhana's perspective. There is also a perspective that is even Dushashana's perspective. Unfortunately, because we reduce it to black and white, the so-called black never gets its case presented.
Hello, sir. Sir, you said that the Mahabharata has a core element of truth. So, is it an elevated narrative of civilization with some ideals infused into it, or it is rather a grand narrative of ideals, virtues, and of humanity, which on the surface is coated with some geographical and historical details to earn our belief? Like when one reads Mahabharata, there is a confusion between facts, the truth, and the ideals. How does one balance that?
That is a very long statement, but I am thoroughly confused. Look at it this way. The Mahabharata, in my belief, for several reasons, has a core element of truth. Take, for example, the following. Ashwathama's mother, Kripi, had thin hair and teeth that jutted out. This seems such irrelevant trivia and detail to the rest of the story that faced with something like this, you're forced to the conclusion that whoever was describing it was describing a real person. All the geographical places mentioned in the Mahabharata have been tracked down through archaeological excavations. This does not mean that everything occurred exactly as portrayed. Because in the Mahabharata itself we are told that there was a core story that the Vedavyasa wrote in 8,800 shlokas, which was later expanded to 25,000 shlokas and finally expanded again to 100,000 shlokas. So obviously there were embellishments, because this was not a period in time where the composition was rendered into writing. It was passed down by word of mouth, so therefore succeeding generations wrote various things. Coming back to your question, I will interpret your question differently. Every society evolves a template. That template lays down notions of crime. What is a crime? Like the Indian Penal Code does. That societal norm lays down what is good behavior, what is perceived to be good behavior. That norm lays down what I mentioned earlier, varnashram dharma. But the point about the Mahabharata, which is the point I'm trying to make, I have tried to make, and that's what I will reiterate in the context of your question, is the point about the Mahabharata is beyond all of this template. Dharma is fundamentally about your individual choice. In that particular sense, the Mahabharata is extremely individualistic. It is not society which is telling you what to do. It is not the king who is telling you what to do. It is your own individual decision. And that is the most important message of the Mahabharata. And depending on the individual decision you take, depending on what you perceive to be dharma, you will have to face the consequences.
Good evening, sir. So I'm having one question. Sir, just now you mentioned that dharma is the individuality which one's retain. So I want to ask that Yudhishthira, he basically believed in speaking the truth. So in Dronacharya's case, he vowed that he would only die when Ashwatthama will die. So when Dronacharya wanted to speak the truth that Ashwatthama did not really die, it is an elephant name of Ashwatthama which died. Why did Krishna didn't allow to retain Yudhishthira his dharma by blowing the conch when he said Ashwatthama hata iti gaja? Why means that Krishna didn't allow to retain his dharma?
All right. You're asking actually three different questions. Firstly, as a result of that lie, Yudhishthira bore the consequences. It is not as if that lie went unpunished. If you don't know what consequences, please read the Mahabharata, I won't tell you.
I'll surely, sir.
Second, not just in the Mahabharata, in several texts, including the Manu Samhita, it is stated that it is not necessarily the case that telling the truth is desirable. If telling the truth leads to evil consequences, then telling the truth is not necessarily desirable. And I still have a little bit of time, so I will give you an example of that. There was a sage named Animandavya. Sage Animandavya was meditating in the middle of the forest when along came some travelers. And those travelers were being chased by bandits. And Animandavya was at a fork in the road. And the travelers could have gone either to the right or to the left. The travelers went to the right. The bandits pursuing the travelers came upon Animandavya and asked, "In which direction have the bandits gone?" And Animandavya, who was devoted to the truth, said, "That direction." So the bandits caught hold of the travelers and killed them. Animandavya told the truth. And because that telling of the truth was not necessarily desirable, he was punished. The last bit I will not answer because I will run out of time. Mr. Chawla, for next time. No, this requires half an hour. This is Krishna's actions. This
Thank you,
pertains
sir.
to
Thank you for
Krishna's
your
actions.
answer. Thank you, sir.
All right. I don't see any more hands. Oh, there.
I would like to ask you a simple question, that there are so many economic and social value aspects of the Mahabharata that require a lot of time to elaborate, but can you just elaborate some of the social values that are common still today, that were there in the past, during the time when the Mahabharata was compiled?
This again requires a very, very comprehensive answer. I've already hinted at you. Read particularly the Shanti Parva and the Anushasana Parva parts. If you want it in capsule form, which everyone wants today, without taking the pains to read the Mahabharata, I would recommend Badrinath Chaturvedi's book.
I have one more question. Like you said, Animandavya...
Not another complicated question.
No, it's very simple. Like you said, Animandavya's question, he knew the direct consequences of what was going to happen.
He did not know.
But he knew that the bandits would capture the travelers and kill them.
Yes.
But there are so many times in life that we do not know the consequences of our actions and we are forced to follow our dharma. So what do you think the Mahabharata in what way guides us here?
It does not, and it is not meant to. All it is saying is there is no absolute notion of what is right and wrong. Yes, as an individual, you do not know the consequences of the action. Had you known the consequences of the action, then beforehand, what economists say ex ante, you may or may not have taken that course of action. Nonetheless, you will have to reap the consequences.
Thank you.
Sir, Sir.
I will agree with you, except to say that a lot of research is also done in India. One does not have to go to Germany and Oxford.
Sir, you said that when Dhritarashtra was lying in a deathbed, and when...
Not Dhritarashtra.
Sorry, sir. I'm poor in that. Bhishma was lying in that bed, and he said to Yudhishthira that his first Rajadharma was that when a rich person makes a crime, he should pay fine and he should be released. But that is not the case for a poor person. Therefore, isn't that in this case Mahabharata doesn't use the proper application of equality of human beings? That when each human being does anything wrong, he or she should be prisoned. Why should a rich be just left because he or she has the money and he or she can pay the money, and a poor with no money has to be captured? Why is this in Mahabharata, sir?
That is the beauty of the Mahabharata, because there are differing points of view. I keep saying, do not expect categorical answers. I gave you a very plausible reason. You are giving me a very plausible counter-argument. And that is precisely the reason why we keep reading it, because we will keep on debating it.
Thank you, sir.
Kartika, will I answer this question? He asked me what triggered the translation of the Mahabharata. I think I should, with you being here, I should answer this question properly. I had a book on attitudes to dogs in Hinduism and Buddhism. Kartika doesn't know this. I didn't tell her this then. It was turned down by 14 publishers. Before Kartika in Penguin decided to publish it, and it was called Sarama and Her Children. After that, Kartika asked me to do a translation of the Bhagavad Gita for Penguin, which I did. By then, I had begun to read unabridged translations of the Mahabharata in Sanskrit, and also unabridged translations in English. And you may or may not be aware that there are only 3 unabridged translations of the Mahabharata in English. The first one was done by Kishori Mohan Ganguly between 1885 and 1895. The second one was done by Manmathanath Datta between 1895 and 1905. And the third one is mine, which only proves that Bengalis tend to be slightly mad. There are others who have attempted it midway but died. One of these gentlemen who attempted it midway and died was Professor Van Buitenen from the University of Chicago. Professor Van Buitenen from the University of Chicago began to translate it, and when I began to read it, I had all kinds of problems with what he had done. And then I began to ask myself the question that criticizing the Westerners for having imperfectly translated something is completely negative until we ourselves do our own translations. That is how this work started. And just for the record, after that, the Harivansha, which is a sequel to the Mahabharata, has been published. I am now about 2/3 of the way through translating the Valmiki Ramayana, which will be published again by Penguin next year.
We shall take that as the last question. Thank you so much, Mr. Debroy. And I'll request Mr. Chawla to please join us here and present a small token of appreciation. And we were supposed to serve tea and coffee now, but due to security reasons, once the closing ceremony is over and the Honorable Chief Minister is gone, we will serve you coffee so that you and us can sit together over some informal chit-chat. May I now have Mr. Chawla on stage, please, for presenting a small token of gratitude to Mr. Debroy. and his vast knowledge of this epic shall definitely inspire the younger generation to pick mythology as a subject for their future writing.